The Rise of the Far Right in Europe. Chapter 2. Neo-Fascism from the 20th Century to the Third Millennium. The Case of Italy. By Giovanna Campani. Introduction. Italian political history over the last 100 years offers a unique opportunity to analyze the relationships between fascism and populism. Fascism, an ideology and a totalitarian way of organizing society, is an Italian invention. It emerged as an unexpected political change following the crisis of the parliamentary system shaken by class conflicts during the troubled years after World War I. Created in Italy, fascism was copied and readapted to national contexts in other European countries, from Nazi Germany to Franco's Spain. The Italian fascist regime lasted for 20 years. In 1943, the military defeat of Italy, allied by Nazi Germany in World War II, provoked its fall. A popular reaction, the resistance, battled at the same time against the brutal German occupation and the criminal Nazi collaborationist regime of the Salo Republic led by Benito Mussolini. The resistance represents a refoundation of the Italian nation. In spite of the disastrous outcomes of fascism, the huge sufferings provoked by war, the military defeat, the participation in Germany's crimes against humanity during the persecution of Jews, the perpetration of war crimes in Slovenia and Croatia, a minority of Italians, both for personal and political reasons, remained faithful to the fascist ideology. As for the majority, elements of fascism remained in their worldview, everyday practices, and mentality. The political and cultural legacy of fascism was not erased by a limited defascization. A profound mistrust of liberal democracy and the party system survived in the mentality that was shaped during fascism. It is no coincidence that the DNA of the two dominant parties after the war, the Christian Democrats and the Communists, contained no liberal democracy, and they endorsed it only during the 1960s and 70s with various caveats. The rejection of liberal democracy and of the party system led to the success of a curious post-war movement. The Ordinary Man gathered around a satirical magazine founded by Guglielmo Gianni in 1944, when the Allied forces were still in charge of the country and the political parties in the process of reorganizing, attacking the elite, opposing the professionalism of politicians, and resisting taxes. Uomo Qualunque, the Ordinary Man, aimed to represent the ordinary man against negatively depicted politicians. Defined as a populist movement, it differed considerably from fascism. For example, it supported a small state, exactly the opposite of the totalitarian idea of the fascist state. Moreover, the satirical magazine called Mussolini the clown of Predeppo. When Uomo Qualunque was dissolved in 1948, many of its voters probably turned to the new neo-fascist party, the MSI, Movimento Sociale Italiano, the Italian social movement, founded in late 1946, despite the fact that the Italian constitution prohibited the re-establishment of the fascist party, which had nothing to do with ideological similarities, but it was a consequence of the mistrust of the parliamentary regime. While Uomo Qualunque had a short life, the MSI, although it represented a minority of Italians, in the first national elections, it achieved 2% of the vote, and its highest tally over the years was 8.6%, with an average of 5 to 6%, and had no hope of becoming a hegemonic political force, cast a long shadow over the political landscape. The MSI maintained elements of the fascist tradition, fidelity to Mussolini, the idea of a strong authoritarian state, a sense of hierarchy, while constantly readapting its traditional messages, including anti-Semitism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Americanism, to the changing context. This binary process preservation and adaptation, was marked by frequent divisions between the two souls of the MSI, dimensions defined by the historian Renzo de Felice as fascism as a movement and fascism as a regime. Tension between the search for respectability in the parliamentary system and violent revolutionary action characterized the MSI and produced a scattered neo-fascist archipelago far beyond the party structure. Caught in a third position between Anglo-American capitalism and communism, neo-fascism, of both respectable and revolutionary kinds, finally chose to target communism as its main enemy, but lost part in its raison d'etre after the fall of the Berlin Wall and a rapidly changing world that no longer corresponded to the old political categories. New right-wing movements and parties such as the Northern League offered responses to globalization, post-industrial economic conditions, immigration, and European Union constraints, with consequent loss of sovereignty, challenged the old nationalistic fascist ideology with new narratives, focusing on identity politics, emphasizing strong polarizations, and defining far more motivating priorities: taxes, political corruption, and immigration. Confronted by new political competitors, neo-fascists were forced to redefine their place in the political landscape. While respectable neo-fascism decided to definitively abandon the fascist legacy and to ally with the mainstream liberal right-wing party of Silvio Berlusconi, the revolutionary component tried to readapt the fascist identity to the new millennium, redefining targets, rethinking political communication, and incorporating youth cultures. This new phase of neo-fascism shares political themes and mass movements against globalization, immigration, multiculturalism, and the EU with parties that, like the Northern League, are generally defined as populist. Converges should not, however, hide multiple differences between neo-fascism and the so-called populisms and far-right extremism that is not embedded in the fascist tradition, occurring relatively rarely in Italy, but frequently in the rest of Europe. During the 1970s, Gino Germani, an anti-fascist exiled in Argentina, compared European fascism to Latin American populism. Having experienced fascism and the rise of Peronism, Germani had become aware of the contradictions that existed in contexts where liberal economy and formal democracy were perceived as expressions of an oligarchy ultimately allied with foreign imperialist powers that has failed to provide a model for modernization, social justice, and effective participation. In Authoritarianism, Fascism, and National Populism, published in 1975, Germani describes the general theory of authoritarianism in modern society and applies it to authoritarian movements and regimes likely to emerge from the social mobility of the middle and lower classes together with the aim of promoting modernization. Germani takes into account political, economic, and class dimensions. Nowadays, the Italian academic literature on neo-fascism, right-wing extremism, and populism, developed by scholars such as Pietro Ingrassi, Marco Tarci, and Uvo Diamanti, offers interesting analytical tools that break the generic notion of populism and take account of the social, economic, and socio-political structures, such as the social blocks behind one or another of the political movements and parties labeled populist. This chapter looks at the political dynamics surrounding the evolution of neo-fascism and neo-fascist groups and parties in post-war Italy up to the present day, and then focuses on Casa Pound and Forza Nova, their symbols, beliefs, values, and othering. As this chapter shows, migration is far from the central issue of their political message. Instead, their main component is now the system. Corrupt politics, financial capitalism, the European Union, which is an instrument of financial capitalism and has deprived its Italy of sovereignty. The last section looks at the victims of neo-fascist organizations and the resistance to them, established by organizations by ANPI. Neo-fascism in post-war Italy. Legacy of the past, adapting to changing post-war contexts. The founders of MSI, most of them active in the Fascist Party and the Salo Republic, aimed to reunite the different souls of the fascism movement and the fascist regime. The transcendent, revolutionary, socialistic, anti-capitalist, anti-American, anti-Semitic soul representing the initial period and the end of fascism, and the right-minded, traditionalist soul favoring order and authority representing the period of the fascist government from 1928 to 1943. The two souls joined forces to revive Mussolini's fascism, to indicate a third way between Anglo-American capitalism and communism to overcome the corrupt and inept democracy and re-establish the authoritarian state. They accepted the parliamentary system in order to push the country's political axis towards the right. In the name of the anti-communist fight, they accepted, tactically, pro-Atlanticism, the NATO choice, despite rejecting consumerist values and the American way of life. The compromises between the souls seem to have been difficult over the years. In 1956, the moderate line chosen by the majority of the MSI pushed some opponents out of the party. They founded the Centro Studi Ordini Novo, New Order, which became a point of reference for the neo-fascist extremism. Ordini Novo enhanced the anti-parliamentarian tone, launched a process of redefinition of the fascist doctrine, and supported a campaign of assaults and provocation against individual opponents and organizations. Violent militancy became an important dimension of neo-fascism, ideologically justified by Mussolini's postulate on the primary of direct action. In 1960, a new division inside New Order led to the foundation of the National Vanguard, whose symbol was the odal, a letter of the ancient runic alphabet positioned at the center of a white circle surrounded by red, exactly like the flag of the Third Reich. From the 1960s onwards, influences coming directly from the neo-Nazi world, like the odal or the Celtic Cross, the symbol of the SS division, started to facilitate the youngest component of Italian neo-fascism. Introducing these symbols signified a detachment from Italian fascism and new interest in Nazism and Eastern European fascism. The Roman Cordonu and the Belgian Del Orel became reference points, together with Julius Evola, whose vision of the tradition as a timeless entity running through the history of ancient times led to the discovery of the Nordic sagas, and also indirectly to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The training camps organized for neo-fascist militants were called Hobbit camps. Avanguardia Nacional established links with European neo-fascism in the form of a French institute, the New Right, joining a project that bypassed individual nationalisms in favor of European nationalism, able to release the old continent from the logic of the Cold War between the United States and the USSR to pursue a refoundation of fascist Europe, recovering the design of the new European order developed by the Nazis. The opening towards Europe was seen positively by militants who felt marginalized by the left-oriented Italian mainstream culture, as a Tuscan neo-fascist militant recalls. The symbolism that refers to the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit comes from the culture of the 1970s. The New Right at that time, the right was ghettoized, attacked. It was an attempt to find in fantasy world the answers that reality did not give, to build a parallel universe like Tolkien's Middle-earth. Of course, there are also deep meanings in the Lord of the Rings, respect for nature, the ethical warrior. While looking towards Europe, Italian neo-fascism continued to demonstrate specific characteristics. The legacy of the 20-year-long fascist regime meant that neo-fascism had a more significant presence than in other European countries. In spite of a relatively low electoral success and the perceived marginalization spoken of by the militant interviewed, excluded from the official political power, the so-called constitutional arc, because of the anti-fascist foundations of the Republic, the MSI developed local sports associations, youth organizations, and a trade union, associations of fascist veterans, and magazines, and the party's daily paper, The Century of Italy. After the loss of representation monopoly by the MSI, various neo-fascist organizations could mobilize different population groups. The older militants of the MSI, nostalgic for the benefits that the strong fascist state brought to the lower middle class, were in favor of law and order model represented by the MSI. Younger people, keen on the rebellion that exploded in 1968 movements, found their way into the extra-parliamentary militancy. In the troubled 1960s and 70s, neo-fascism, mainly its extra-parliamentary component, was a part of a process defined as the strategy of tension, a plan elaborated by a few heads of the army and intelligence services who did not reject terrorist actions in order to avoid the country turning to communism. The strategy of tension developed in different forms: attempts to induce the public to identify the struggles of students and workers as a danger to public order, blaming bombings on left-wing organizations as protagonists of those of the struggles, hypothesis of a coup in the authoritarian sense, inspired by the model of the Greek colonels or of Latin American examples such as Chile. A few neo-fascist leaders associated with the strategy of tension tried to develop their own strategy in order to gain power through subversion. Some of the subversive strategies, everyday violence in the streets, schools, universities, factories, against left-oriented political and cultural centers, against left militants, reminded of the practices of the squads of the 1920s and continually with the legacy of revolutionary fascism. The violence finds its place as a dynamic that responds to the logic of the political action that funds the neo-fascist paradigm. Violence may, incidentally, be a criterion determining whether a neo-fascist group belongs to the extreme right or not, in opposition to the democratic system. Orphans of the Cold War, from MSI to Fiamma Tricolore and Forza Nova. On the 2nd of August in 1980, tension reached its highest point in the massacre at Bologna railway station, where a bomb killed 85 people. Responsibility for this act of terrorism was attributed to the neo-fascist militants, members of the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, NAR, Revolutionary Armed Nuclei. The subsequent dismantling by the police and the largest extra-parliamentary neo-fascist organizations meant a period of exile or low profile for many militants. In the meantime, the global context was radically changing. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of the Cold War. Neoliberalism was the new triumphant model, while the nation-state was weakening. The European Union was becoming a crucial political and institutional actor. In 1991, the Italian Communist Party changed its name and strategy. The same year, a new party, the Lega Nord, Northern League, created from scratch, introduced identity politics to the Italian political debate, invented the land of Padania and the Padan people, reproduced supposed Celtic rituals, and invited the masses to Pontida to celebrate Alberto de Giussano, hero of a 1,000-year-old battle. The confrontation between communists and fascists lost direction. The century of ideologies is ending, declared the MSI secretary Gianfranco Fini, at the party's Congress at Fugi in 1995, encouraging the delegates to abandon the fascist legacy. It buries the totalitarian temptations that have marked it. With the contradictions and its fierce clashes, the third millennium masses will be protagonists of history, citizens aware of their role. No one will question the notion of freedom as a supreme value. Feeney asked the MSI militants to fully accept liberal democracy, to renounce to the old project of remaining faithful to the fascist legacy, and to become a modern European democratic right. The new context favored ending the political marginalization of the MSI. Christian Democrats and Socialists collapsed in 1993 and 1994 under the weight of corruption. A brand new party, Force for Italy, emerged, and its leader, Silvio Berlusconi, was prepared to legitimize the MSI as a political partner in order to have a sufficient electoral majority. The transformation of the MSI into a democratic European Conservative Party, National Alliance, allied with Berlusconi's openly liberal party, could not be approved by many MSI activists, such as Pino Rauti, who considered Feeney a traitor. Breaking with him, they founded the Tricolored Flame, while proudly defending the fascist legacy. Pino Rauti positioned the Fiamma Tricolore in a strong social and popular space, supporting the lower middle and the working classes against globalization and neoliberalism. The choice of social fascism answered the demands of MSI voters, mainly from the lower middle and working classes. The Fiamma Tricolore quickly lost the monopoly of neo-fascist representation. In 1997, Roberto Fiore, a former member of the NAR, having escaped to London to avoid jail after the Bologna massacre, came back to Italy, and together with Massimo Morsello, former activist of the Avanguardia Nazionale, founded the Party of Forza Nuova. The new party aimed to compete with the Fiamma Tricolore for hegemony of the far right. The competition was mainly not about elections. Extreme neo-fascism gets less than 3% at a national level, but about direct activism, organizing street protests, demonstrations and marches, and political campaigns that continued the neo-fascist movements in the 1970s. To expand the party base, Roberto Fiore, applying tactics learned in Britain, developed a strategy of recruiting among radical soccer clubs. FN quickly took over right-wing clubs like Lazio FC, but also traditionally left-wing clubs such as Romana AC. Today, FN controls most Italian teams' fan clubs. Its leaders, who belong to an older generation, have successfully attracted young people by establishing special relationships with the skinhead movement, which originally represented a music style in British working-class urban culture and had nothing to do with fascism. According to the few studies on the topic, the years 1982 and 1983 marked the Italian explosion of Oi, a subgenre of punk music, representing the anarchist or apolitical skinheads. While in most cities like Bologna, Genoa, and Pisa, the skinhead movement was in line with the original assumptions of Oi. In Milan and the Veneto region, it was monopolized by neo-fascism through the activism of militants in the Movimento Politico Occidentale, Western political movement, founded in 1984 by Maurizio Boccaci in an attempt to reconstruct neo-fascism after dismantling of the largest extra-parliamentary organizations following the Bologna massacre. The skinheads' incorporation into neo-fascism was reinforced in the years between 1985 and 1990 when football became one of their central interests and they joined fan clubs controlled by the FN, sought to domesticate them while cultivating their radical and violent action on specific occasions, such as gay pride events. The relationships with fan clubs and skinheads, who are at the same time kept at a certain distance to be used at crucial moments, reveals FN's double-dealing, respectable political party, and revolutionary violent movement, and continues the neo-fascist tradition in Italy. The scattered archipelago of Italian neo-fascism in the new millennium. In the global world of triumphant neoliberalism, the distinction between moderate and revolutionary components remains the principal characteristic of a neo-fascist archipelago in search of a new narrative. This division is crossed by other multiple divisions that concern both Fenians, a group that gave birth to the post-fascist Democratic Party, Alleanza Nazionale, and was ready to abandon most of its fascist legacy, and those faithful to the fascist legacy initially reunited in the Fiamma Tricolore. Gianfranco Fini's experiment, building a conservative party out of neo-fascism, quickly failed. Fiamma Tricolore was just the first of several divisions. In 2004, it was the turn of Alexandra Mussolini, Benito Mussolini's granddaughter, to leave Alleanza Nazionale to create a new group, Social Alternative. In 2007, the Lazio region's president, Francesco Storacci, left Alleanza Nazionale to form the Right. These small neo-fascist parties, the moderate and parliamentarian part of neo-fascism, were short-lived, and in order to survive, were sooner or later forced to make alliances with Silvio Berlusconi in local or national elections. Weakened by scissions, the 2008 Alleanza Nazionale joined Berlusconi's party, the PDL, Freedom's People. In 2012, a group of former members of Alleanza Nazionale had entered the PDL, created a new neo-fascist party, Italy's Brothers, which is today active present in all Italian politics with 3-4% of the vote. Its political message is close to that of the French National Front: an end to massive immigration, a return to national sovereignty, reduction of EU power, rejection of austerity measures imposed by the EU. In spite of its different sensibilities, the neo-fascist element that went through the experience of Alleanza Nazionale has been active, with various responsibilities in Italian politics during the Berlusconi governments, has completely absorbed the idea of liberal democracy in the parliamentary system. On the other hand, acceptance of the rules of liberal democracy does not accord with deep convictions of many militants in the revolutionary component, for whom the temptation to reject the system as a whole is always there. As an FN militant from Venice explains, "For us, democracy can be a value, but only if it's true. If it is a simulacrum, then I can only say no. What they are offering is demagoguery, circumlocution for the gullible oligarchy. We are in a state that is definitely not democratic, in a Europe that is not democratic, that does not listen to her citizens. There are other ways of doing democracy, which is a more direct democracy, where the citizens must be informed. So democracy, but not this one." For him, as for many others, the electoral rituals of liberal democracy are less important than direct activism. As a Tuscan FN militant observes, being a social force, we will never accept going with a strong liberal party like the PDL. In spite of their common rejection of the system, globalization, the neoliberal model, EU consensus, their differing views on priorities and strategies produce divisions within the revolutionary element of neo-fascism. As we have seen, FN was founded to contest the hegemony of the Fiamma Tricolore, whose unity lasted a few years. In 2008, Gianluca Inano, a former singer and football fan, and Mauricio Boccaci, a former leader of Movimento Politico Alle at the junction between neo-fascism and skinheads. Left, Boccacci founded the neo-Nazi anti-Semitic organization Militia, a marginal group which had many problems with the law. Gianluca Ianon created the national structure of Casa Pound, a youth cultural center opened in 2003 by militants in an occupied building in the Esquilino area of Rome. Militia demonstrates that anti-Semitism is still extremely strong in the neo-fascist Italian area, at least on the most extreme fringes. The Judeo-Masonic conspiracy is no longer a maybe, it's a matter of fact. I invite you all to look at all of the economic leaders of Wall Street, name by name, from Madoff to the Italian De Benetti. They are all people of Jewish faith, and it was them who created the international crisis we are experiencing today. From an interview with a militia militant in Rome. With its strong focus on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust denial, militia is close to neo-Nazi ideology. Fiercely anti-Zionist, they are openly pro-Palestinian. Casa Pound, CP, the fascists of the third millennium, as they call themselves, represents the most original expression of neo-fascism, having a very strong social dimension. They fight for the right to public housing for all, and at the same time, a very innovative political language close to youth cultures. Casa Pound activists produce alternative music. They have a streaming radio station, Radio Bandera Nera, Black Flag, as a reference both to fascism and to pirates, a film club, magazines, and a newsletter. They run various fashionable websites frequented by young people and use MySpace and Facebook. They have launched new types of activity called futurist or squads media, such as the attack on the home of the popular TV show The Loft, symbol of the alienation mainstream media imposes on youth. They have around 5,000 official members, with many more sympathizers. Casa Pound and Forza Nova, different symbols and values. Both CP and FN reject fascism and nostalgia, intend to adapt fascism to the new millennium, and aim to approach youth cultures. The differences between them are, however, important. The term fascist of the third millennium means to assume a heritage of values, ideas, roots, traditions, and bring it to the third millennium, updating it. This is the reason why Casa Pound was born, because we believe that core fascist values, the state, social welfare, identity, are the best to oppose globalization, capitalism, and modern society as it is being established and built. Rejecting the label nostalgic for fascism, FN militants explain that today there is no decent social policy as there was during the fascist years. For many of our opponents, we are seen as nostalgic for fascism. Frankly, we do not long for somebody speaking from a balcony of a square. What we miss is the most advanced social state fascism had implemented. Do not forget that in fascist times, social laws, social measures were at the forefront. FM's web page, publications, and electoral leaflets show few clear symbols of Italian fascism. No images of Mussolini, no fasces. The Celtic Cross in red and black predominates. Casa Pound has a completely different symbols and criticizes the use of the Celtic Cross. In our symbolism, in the slogans, it seems clear even to a superficial observer that we do not want to follow antiquated traditions. We use the tortoise rather than the flames, the Celtic Cross, and so on. The previous generation took them to the streets, kept them in the heart. But our opinion, they are no longer suitable for the third millennium or for the political or social reality for the country today. The symbol of the tortoise is explained thus. The first battle of Casa Pound is that of the house. The tortoise is an animal that carries its home on its back. Therefore, what better a symbol for the battle of the house than the tortoise? In addition, the tortoise is an animal that lives long, gives this idea of something lasting over years, solid. The four arrows pointing towards the center represent the centrality that Casa Pound wants to represent, the center of national revival, the national revolution. As a matter of fact, many Italian political forces and the Prime Minister Renzi evoke the need for a national revival in the face of crisis and decay that characterizes Italy today. One step in this direction is to change the Italian political class, whose are widely rejected in the political practices. Still, while other forces, such as the Five Stars movement of Gabreilla or the leftist element of the mainstreamed Democratic Party, see the solution as introducing greater democracy, participation and control over politics by citizens. Casa Pound and FN support the idea of politics based on spiritual values and of militancy as moral commitment. Some militants quote past models such as ancient Sparta. Two organizations have, however, a quite different idea of spiritual values that should sustain politics. Inspired by Julius Evola's philosophy, the FN ideology venerates a tradition that represents the overlap between spiritual values and roots, both transmitted from one generation to the other, inside a specific community considered as an organic body. The values, the eternal community values, are important. Tradition is important. Certainly it must be renewed. But the cornerstones of tradition can give us answers. Those who stray too far from the tree of tradition and the roots are lost, break down, and remain confused. FN identifies spiritual values with the Roman Catholic tradition, transforming the Celtic Cross into a Christian symbol. The Celtic Cross represents Catholicism, the European tradition. According to an FN militant from Rome, the Celtic Cross has a double meaning. It represents the intersection of spiritual values and the material world, the first dominating the second. The Celtic Cross is the intersection of the vertical view of the world acting on horizontally, which is daily life, material life. It means the spiritual principle that intersects with life. The circularity represents other aspects. Moreover, it is a symbol that also refers to the Christian cross. The combination of fundamentalist Catholicism and the Neo-Fascist tradition is peculiar to FN and is expressed by other Christian symbols. Archangel Michael is FN's protector. FN was founded on the 29th of September, the day of Archangel Michael. He is the prince of the heavenly army, who led the revolt against the army of Satan, and the symbol of good, that armed defeats evil. Casa Pound also wants to introduce spiritual values into politics, but it does not think that these spiritual values should be religious. On the contrary, they should be secular, in continuity with the Hegelian fascist idea of the state. Casa Pound is very critical of what they consider nonsense, a political proposal that would support a sort of Pope King. Casa Pound defends the idea of the state of a historical fascism. State is a value, the ultimate goal of all, the people who join in the state. No other institution should impose its dogmas, as does the Church, because even those who are not, unfortunately or fortunately, believers, have to collide economically, socially, culturally, with the dictates of the Catholic Church, which I think absolutely unfair. Casa Pound is in favor of a secular, non-confessional state where no religion should have an advantage over others, but it does not oppose the building of mosques. The militants interviewed insist that Casa Pound is not Islamophobic. They have Syrian militants, they have Syrian flags and demonstrations, and they recall what Mussolini received, the sword of Islam. This difference in attitude to religion between FN and Casa Pound affects family policies and gender relations. FN is obsessive in its opposition to abortion and gay marriage, tolerated by Casa Pound. The old slogan of French Vichy government, God, Fatherland, and Family, has been revitalized by FN, who are building their value system around it. A link between earth, family, social group, forming a nation, an organic construction of the social fabric for us is always present. God, Fatherland, and Family. The same slogan, God, Fatherland, and Family, is accepted by Casapound, but it has a completely different meaning. We can use it, but without Catholic implications. God is in the spiritual dimension. Family is the large family of brothers, which is your people, your country. From tradition to the organic nation, opposition to multiculturalism and globalization. For FN, tradition is connected to an organic idea of the nation, in the continuum from the earth through family to society. Nation is identity and belonging, opposed to bourgeoisie nationalism, that is a society divided into social classes, where big capitalists and corrupt politicians use nationalism for their interest, as the present European leaders do. From an interview with an FN militant in Rome. The FN idea of nation corresponds to the people held together by common values and solidarity among the members of the society community. The two concepts overlap. In practice, people's cohesion and solidarity is ensured by a particular idea of race as a biological concept, even if this is denied by most FN militants interviewed. The genetic racialization of the nation is explicitly expressed by one militant. We are loyal to the principle that is also genetic, of blood, of the soil. Not all interviewees mention the concept of biological race, and it is always a question of identity and culture. Yet behind the fierce opposition to hybridization and mixed marriages lies a racial principle. There may have been in the history of some peoples a mixing with other peoples, but the best thing is to have an area for each people to grow and to develop as one people. There are people who are mixed, creating intermediate people. There are people like this in Africa. In Ethiopia, you will see that they are not entirely Bantu or totally white Arabic. They are born from the mixing and new people that has emerged. However, they have developed in their territory, where they have been able to create their own culture, to live their lives. They are not a guest in other people's homes. That is too humiliating. It is certainly not beautiful. Whereas FN goes back to some form of biological racism, Casapound insists on cultural differences marking the borders of nations and groups. Casapound loves difference. Casapound wants to preserve difference. Casapound advocates a different world that is the opposite of rejection or hatred of other cultures or races or of other ethnic groups. On the contrary, we believe that it is a form of violence that is preached by the left, that is forced inclusion, integration. Integration is violence, if you look at it from a certain point of view. They express, moreover, an ideological universalism, rejecting biological racism. Talking about spirit and race, I can tell you that Casapound coined this slogan, "Our race is the spirit." In this sense, I think Ascaro, who fought with fascism in Africa in 1936, is more my brother than an Italian partisan. He is my brother, fought for my national idea, for the imperial idea, for an idea of social justice. He is much more my brother, I repeat, than a partisan who sold our home to the invading foreigner. And today we are paying the consequences. So our race is not a biological discourse, it is a spiritual discourse. Leaving aside an interpretation of history that completely denies the foundations of the Italian Republic, this Casapound militant suggests the idea of a biological brotherhood that goes beyond race, a sort of international fascism that brings together blacks and whites. Nation, globalization, and immigration. FN and Casapound justify their opposition to immigration with their idea of an organic nation, society, community, referring either to a biological idea or race or a homogeneous cultural ideological identity. And with a critical analysis of globalization and the neoliberal capitalist domination that deliberately provokes immigration. Both FN and Casapound are against globalization, the aim of which, as they see it, is to destroy differences between peoples and produce homogenization. Look, I see the differences as I travel. If I make the whole world alike, uniform, standardized, it becomes a monster. And who is this uniform world good for? For consumers, capitalists, and those who have to sell products, because they can standardize them. The economy is simple, standardizing everything to sell all over the world, transforming everyone into identical consumers to destroy individuality. I am willing to go to the stake for this. The end of individuality is the end of the meaning of life. If I lose that, I lose every reason why we are in the world. This is what I think of it. An interview with an FN militant, Pisa. Behind globalization lie the forces of capitalism and of finance. These same forces are also behind the uncontrolled migration, as the FN militant from Rome explains. Immigration is the fault of the capitalist system. The multinationals that exploit third world countries, forcing these people to immigrate, then exploiting them. These people represent a workforce that is more exploitable than Italian workers, creating competition among Italian workers. Another militant clarifies FN's position on immigration. Our discourse on immigration is broad. We think that migration flows have been caused by specific liberal policy and in combination with the mafia, in the sense that having people in slavery, cheap workforce is coming from desperate situations. Whom does it suit? The entrepreneurs who pay them informally and the mafias. We do not attack immigrants arriving by boat because they are obviously desperate. We are Christians. We could not say we will bomb them into the sea, as the League sometimes does. That's vulgar. We say something else. We have to help them in their own country. Casapan also links the growth of immigration to the various underground organizations that the corrupt system does not really want to destroy. The slogan "Against Immigration, but not against migrants" summarizes the FN and Casapan arguments on migration policies. Immigration is regarded as a consequence of globalization, impoverishing the countries of origin and creating tensions in the countries of destination. Both FN and Casapan believe in developing the countries of origin through international cooperation. Casapan has an NGO for cooperation in Kenya. Both organizations believe that Italy cannot support current numbers of immigrants for economic and social reasons. On the basis of this analysis, FN's political agenda is a total ban on immigration and encouragement of repatriation. As far as immigration goes, we have always been clear. A total ban is our recipe, and a humanitarian repatriation of those who are illegally on our national territory. Look, we don't like being labeled racist or xenophobic. The word xenophobia literally comes from the fear of a foreigner. We are not afraid of the others. But for example, in a city like Florence, we see illegal immigrants living without dignity, crammed into cardboard shacks under a bridge. We say that immigrant who comes to India should live with dignity, and we figure we can't afford it because this moment in time in Italy does not even have enough work for Italians. Casapan's proposals are similar. We want a total end to immigration now because Italy can neither economically nor socially nor culturally withstand such a large migration flows on its territory. Of course, we are against the forced return of people who are already here, because now, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view, they are already not Italian, but Italianized. And so it would be violence to forcibly send them back to their own country, but we believe in a total end to future flows. The issue of the jus soli. Militants within FN are more insistent on the privileged status of immigrants than those in Casapan. We have nothing against immigrants because, let's face it, immigrants who are offered rights or privileges, it is logical that they accept them. The blame lies with the institutions that offer them at the expense of Italians, and even at their own expense, because then there are families who stop voting Democratic Party or PRC, Communist, for this reason. This argument, immigrants are more privileged than Italians, justifies the FN slogan, Italians first. We are for the national preference. This discourse is often misunderstood. We are accused of racism, but in reality, what we say is different. Given equal conditions and equal needs, we prefer Italians. For example, if we have 5 families in needs and there is an Italian family, the house or the help should be given first to the Italian one as a matter of identity and also out of respect for ourselves. Our fathers have created what we have here. This is not a discourse of exclusion. We do not have the conflicting relationship. We prefer to help Italians. Our activities refer to the Italian cause. It is a matter of identity. Despite the reassuring words of this militant, the idea of a rift between us, Italians, and the others, immigrants, has been translated into racist slogans, demonstrations against reception centers for immigrants, and even attacks on immigrants. It must, however, be stressed that the main victims of violent attacks by the FN and Casa Pound militants are not immigrants, but left-wing activists. FN and Casa Pound support a ban on immigration and are opposed to the production of elements of jus soli in Italian law. The battle started a few years ago, but it has been reinforced during the appointment of the Congolese Cecile Kenji as Minister for Integration. Kenji, back to the Congo, is one of the slogans used by Forza Nuova militants. Congolese and bankers, Italy is dying, combines the xenophobic and anti-capitalist attitudes of the FN militants. For FN, opposition to jus soli corresponds to an idea of national identity that is quasi-biological. We think that the jus soli is a form of violence. What does it mean that if you're born in Italy, you are necessarily Italian by force? We speak of jus sanguinis, not the racist, biological sense, but in the sense of the right to be born from a cultural and identity seeds and to belong to that identity. Casa Pound is more moderate, but it also opposes jus soli and it is in favor of the status quo. We think that the system that exists now is correct. We believe it is neither too harsh nor too soft. It is simply a normal law. There is no need for any further reconstruction, nor any enlargement of citizenship or jus soli. Categorically, the jus soli is rather abhorrent. We stick to this position. We hope that those who are on our territory will not be westernized by force. I do not think that we live in a civilization so superior that which these people come from. We are not used to assessing the civilization of a people, the superiority of one model over another. The Casa Pound cultural relativist approach has been criticized by more extreme neo-fascist groups. You know the site recently closed by the state police, Stormfront. I do not cuddle anybody. I don't cuddle them. I don't beat them. Let them be. Each to his own. We can conclude that immigration is an important issue in the political message of these two neo-fascist organizations. Its ideological role reveals their ideas of a nation and identity and can be easily used to exploit and mobilize xenophobic and racist us against them foreigners feelings. Immigration is also a key issue for the Northern League, which, at least in some areas of the country, competes with the neo-fascist arena. The Northern League, in government between 2001 and 2006 and between 2008 and 2011, is the political party that has most exploited the migration issue and continues to do so. The other parties of the center-right government led by Silvio Berlusconi until 2011 have also often used anti-immigrant rhetoric for electoral purposes. As for Forza Nuova and Casa Pound, migration is far from their central political message. Remaining faithful to the fascist ideology, readapted to the new context, means fighting for a certain idea of state, a strong authoritarian state that organizes people's lives and is responsible for social problems, even though they have violent conflicts with far-left militants, sometimes leading to fatalities. Neo-fascists are deprived of the communist enemy. Consequently, their main opponent now is the system, corrupt politics, financial capitalism, the European Union as an instrument of financial capitalism that has deprived Italy of its sovereignty. Direct activism and violence, reaction and resistance. In recent years, the militancy model for direct activism has generated for both Força Nova and Casa Pound into cases of violence against militants of the far left, against Roma, and against migrants. Official representatives of the two organizations tend to justify and even support collective protests, such as marches at Roma camps, even when some violence is involved, but to distance themselves from the most violent attacks. They generally condemn individual attacks on migrants as the actions of isolated individuals. Casa Pound leaders denied responsibility for the shocking events of 13th of December 2011, when Gianluca Casari, a 50-year-old extreme right militant who used to attend Casa Pound events, killed 2 Senegalese and wounded 3 others in Florence. Then he shot himself in the head during a shootout with the police and died shortly afterwards. Casari is not a militant of our association. He just attended, sometimes, a few activities in Pistoia, and we have no reason to conceal that, declared the leader of Casa Pound in Florence. Today, a tragedy of madness was consumed, and 4 people died for no reason. But if it happened, we should remember that this is also because the state is not able to provide any protection or assistance to its weaker children. The Casa Pound spokesman in Pistoia, Casari's hometown, denied any responsibility, stating he had come a few times to our circle to talk about his book, The Key of Chaos, but we knew that he was a very closed person that gave no confidence. There is no doubt, however, that Gianluca Casari identified himself as a neo-fascist and followed some of the activities of the neo-fascist organization Casa Pound. The leader of the Senegalese community in Florence, Papda, supported by the ANPI, National Association of Italian Partisans, demanded the closure of Casa Pound. His request was rejected. In our interview with him 3 years later, the event, he declared, "One of the first things we asked for, supported by the ANPI, was closure of those places, the headquarters of the neo-fascist groups, because there are places where people are taught to hate. And also, there is a law, the Mancino law, that should prosecute these groups for crime of reconstructing fascism. But, as they say in Italy, once the law is passed, they find a way to break it." According to Papda, the Mancino law, which bans the rebuilding of fascist organizations and is harshly criticized by both neo-fascist movements, is not really enforced. Both Papda and the president of the ANPI believe their request had been rejected because Casa Pound enjoyed support or were at least tolerated among the center-right government led by Berlusconi that was in power at the time of the tragedy. Both denounced the center-right government's role in legitimizing fascism, racism, and hate speech. The ANPI representative even described the government as populist, in a clear reference to the theories of national populism. We, as an association, are very concerned about the situation that has risen, but not now, for 10 years, because with this populist government, fascist symbols, gestures, and attitudes are legitimized. We are opposing groups that are increasingly organized. There are thousands of associations with different names that have the same neo-fascist ideology. They have the media, they have the economic means to support the venues that we are asking to be closed down. The president of ANPI makes 2 arguments that are important for understanding the interaction between the center-right governments and neo-fascism. One is that the center-right government has produced a political discourse legitimizing fascism as a historical experience and an ideology. The other is that it has offered neo-fascist organizations the economic means for expansion. This point of view is shared by militants of the left-wing social centers, who are also often victims of attacks by neo-fascists, as happened to Dax, a left-wing militant from Milan who was attacked by 3 fascist sympathizers and died from his wounds in 2003. The speaker for the Dax Association set up in memory of the victim, makes a clear link between legitimization of fascism and the development of racist ideas supported by the government. In the case of Dax, the murderers were just 3 children of fascist intolerance, children of the various speeches you could have heard in recent years from various Bossi, Fini, when representatives of the Northern League say, if you see an immigrant, grab a gun and shoot at the boat. And why wouldn't someone who really has a weapon do it? The blame, in my opinion, lies with the politicians who make these kinds of speeches, who, because it's easy, they say that there are no jobs because there are immigrants, then blame the immigrants, the homosexuals. These discourses of racial hatred, hatred towards the other, can take root in people who may be a little less aware from a cultural point of view or are psychologically weak. In its fight against neo-fascism and neo-fascist ideas, the ANPI, to which surviving partisans belong, are now open to young people who share resistance values and want to show their opposition to fascism. Our association made a very radical change to its statutes in 2005. The association was previously only for those who had actually been partisan during World War II. Since 2005, we have changed the rules and allowed all anti-fascists, if adult, to be members of the ANPI. Because otherwise, we would have encountered the same problems as many veterans associations, such as those who took part in the liberation of Florence. The members are 92, 93 years old. They are too old for activities. Without young people, we risked disappearing.